The opinions expressed on two-way traffic are those of Darren Coleman and are for general information purposes only. It does not constitute any legally binding engagement between the podcasters and anyone else. Always check with your advisors to obtain your own tax or investment advice. Welcome to Two-Way Traffic with Darren Coleman of Portage Cross-Border Wealth Management. In this series, Darren aims to guide you through the complexities, complications, implications, and most importantly, the advantages of having money and family on both sides of the border. In this episode, immigration lawyer Veronique Malka and mortgage specialist Freddie Abital are back with Darren. Together, they'll help prepare Canadians who are entering the United States to live and to work. Enjoy.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Two-Way Traffic, our podcast on cross-border issues. And I'm joined again today by our friends Veronique Malka and Freddie Abital. So, Veronique, hi, good afternoon.
Hi, Darren. How are you? Hi, Freddie.
Veronique, would you mind just taking a second and just introducing yourself and the work that you do while you're in New Jersey?
Sure. So I'm a Canadian immigration lawyer. I founded and operate a law firm called Canadian Law Group. We focus on assisting Canadians to come to the U.S. and the other way around, Americans coming to Canada, based in New Jersey with affiliated offices in Montreal and Toronto.
And for the purposes of today's particular topic about working in the United States as a Canadian, you are someone who's been in Canada, you're Canadian, and you went to work in New Jersey, right?
That's right.
Okay, so we're going to touch on some of your own personal experience and how that lends into other people that might be doing a similar thing. And Freddie, good afternoon.
What's up, Darren? How are you?
I'm well, thank you. You've also are a Canadian who's now in the United States. Do you want to share with us the work that you do, please?
Sure. Yeah, originally from Montreal. So I own a mortgage bank operating for the last 21 years in the United States. We have offices in 13 different states and operate and lend in 13 different states. We specialize with foreign national clients. We have very unique products when it comes down to foreign national clients, helping not just Canadians, but a big primary focus of Canadians because I'm originally from Canada. So being from there, get a lot of requests, but a lot of Canadians coming to Florida or other states.
Got it. And I'm in Canada, so I'm Canadian in Canada, although my younger brother lives in Massachusetts. So he moved to the United States for work. And we run the largest cross-border practice within Raymond James in North America. So we work a lot with people who move in either direction across the border. So for today, we're going to focus our time and attention on that exact situation. Someone in Canada has a job opportunity. They're moving to the United States. So why don't we dig into it? So Veronique, I'll start with you. So the person's got a job offer in hand. They're going to go work in the United States. Do they just jump in the car, drive across the border, book a flight? Can they just, I got the job offer today. I start on Monday. I'm just going to go. How does it work? Is it that simple? It can't be that simple.
Definitely not. Definitely not. You'd get a nice turnaround at the border if you tried to do that. I mean, unless you were to lie completely at the border and say you're just going for a visit, but effectively you were coming to work in the United States, which would never be advised. So
By the way, before you go on, does that happen? People will just say, yeah, I'm going to go see the other side of Niagara Falls, but they're really going to work. Do people misstate that? I mean, that would be...
Well, those are not the people who call me for advice, so I wouldn't know, but I know that stuff happens. I think people are still barreling over the falls in barrels. I don't know, but that's not our client base, thankfully.
Yeah, you want people that are planning this ahead of time.
To do it right. Yeah,
not calling you from the jail cell going, I have one call, don't hang up, right? We want to
those I refer out. I have people who can handle those. That's not our office. So yeah, I mean, I think the first thing people have to understand, and especially Canadians growing up so close to the American border, we've been cross-border shopping our whole lives. We go back and forth. It used to be a lot easier 20, 30 years ago to go over the border. So, what's the big deal? Somehow we tend to import that simplistic idea. I think that's where your question may stem from in terms of going to work and live.
Our phones work in both countries. We watch the same TV shows.
Exactly.
Like, isn't it the same? Like,
and T-Mobile has cross-border for free. So, you would think.
Well, for you, not for Rogers and Bell could learn a few things. We're still in 1978, I think, with our phone system.
Okay. The reality is a Canadian, when it comes to immigration, is truly a foreign national for United States. Okay, we're no different than a British citizen, a Pakistani. It doesn't matter. We are foreign nationals, no matter how familiar we may be with the United States. So when we want to actually go work in the United States, we could technically be taking the job of an American who could be using that income and working that job. Same system applies for Canada, of course. We want to protect the ability of Americans first in the US to get jobs. The nice thing for Canadians, though, is that we have a treaty with the United States and Mexico. We call it Kuzma into Canada, but it's called UMSCA, going in United States, Mexico, Canada agreement.
I think we all should practice that when we're stressed. And umska, so we should just.
You have to be part of a list of professions that is enumerated in that treaty and have a sponsor, a job offer. But that treaty is great because it will expedite the obtaining of a visa for a Canadian. They'll get a non-immigrant visa called a TN visa for 3 years, renewable indefinitely. So that will allow that person and their dependents, their spouse and their children, will get dependent visas. Then, I'm comfortable with that visa for the most part. Obviously, if somebody would want to stay there permanently and knew that off the bat, they might want to go for a different kind of visa to lead to an immigrant visa that would lead to a green card, or a green card straight off the bat. But it depends on every case.
Yeah. So let's say in this case, the person's got a job offer. They're going to go down and they think they're going to work for a few years, see how it goes. So they get a visa. So now they can go. Now, what about for filing taxes? Do they automatically get a social security number when they get the TN visa? Or do they have to do that separately? Or do they even need one? Can they just write down their Canadian social security number?
No. Everything will change. In the US, they'll have to get an EAD, which is an employment authorization document. Okay, that is a part of the process of applying for a visa. The EAD will then allow them to get a social security number. We call them social insurance numbers in Canada, SSN in the United States. Similar idea. And then with that number, they'll be able to get payrolled and to be paid in American dollars on US soil. Taxation is a different issue. It depends how much time they spend in the US, and we can get into that further.
Now, from a processing timeline, how long if somebody gets that job opportunity in hand, they've got the offer, is it a matter of like a couple of days to get all this stuff done, or is it going to be months? Like how long of a lead time do they probably need to accomplish these things?
Well, the beauty about the treaty that applies to Canadians and Mexicans going into the US is that it actually bypasses the consulate processing, what we call. So you can, as a Canadian, apply directly at the border with, and I want to underline with, the appropriate evidence and prepared application. And you can apply to a CBP officer for admission to the US and to obtain that visa, TN.
But this is stuff they should do before they get there. They're not going to do it at the counter.
No, at the counter, they'll present what, for example, our firm would prepare an application. It would be probably something like 30 pages long.
Okay.
Just
you have one handy.
Like this, right?
Yep.
And then that will be brought to an officer, nice and polished, because they're human too, and they like to be treated with respect. I often say to my clients, hey, when you get to the border, be nice. And they go, oh, well, it's not complicated stuff. Shh, be nice. And I say, remember who has the gun, okay?
Yeah, that's right.
That's the bottom line. There's a reason they went into that job.
So along with being nice, which is really important, I think there's an important thing you said there, which is about being prepared. So if someone plays the home game, goes on the internet, thinks they have the right paperwork and I filled it out right and kind of shows up, they're probably more likely to make a mistake versus if they'd hired a professional like you to make absolutely sure that the full package is done, right? I assume this is fairly complicated and it's easy to make a boo-boo.
Yeah, Darren, I would say for the most part, our clients are sophisticated enough. They know they need a visa. They might think of doing it themselves, but as soon as they drop down on Google, they'll see, ooh, it's not so simple. It could fly back in my face. They'll contact an attorney in the US and they'll ask what's involved. It goes very well until we tell them how much. And then usually there's a little step back.
Yeah, I guess. But getting it wrong is probably more expensive in terms of time and inconvenience, right?
There's no question. There's no question. We're really talking, and I like to be really clear about these things. We're in the couple to a few $1,000s. It's never worth it. It's never, ever worth, and we're talking for 3 years, and then it's much easier to even to renew it. So I would never recommend anyone do this without the proper advice and the proper preparation, of course.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, a bit of a wrinkle to this, because now that so many people can work remotely, they got their laptop, they got their camera built in, they can do it anywhere. So what about the situation of someone who's in Canada that says, look, I'm going to take an opportunity with a US employer, but I'm actually not going to leave my house in Canada? Do they still need to go through this process, or how does that work?
Well, they're not working on US soil. That's the bottom line. They're not necessarily taking the job away from an American. It gets very fudgy in terms of the taxes, and that we don't have an accountant on our group right here today. We do have somebody that we work with, as we all know her, but I think that the idea is at that point to be very clear to make sure the client has the proper advice with respect to taxation.
Yeah, because you're right. That's where it does get very complicated for the employer, because now they're technically an employee in Canadian, and do they have the right payroll set up? So, but I didn't know from the worker's perspective if they still need to get a visa if they're actually not physically in the US. They can take employment, but so that's a whole other subset of issues.
I would definitely, at the very least, get a consultation with a cross-border lawyer when that situation arises, because there are just so many little facets of that need to be looked at. Okay, so are they going to be traveling? Obviously, if you have an employer in the United States, at some point you're going to go there. So then it could become tricky.
Oh,
right?
that's where it gets complicated.
Well, yeah, because you're
Yeah.
working for an American employer, and why the CBP officer at the border is going to ask you, why are you coming in? I'm going to see my boss. Oh, so you work in the US. That's
Yep,
it.
that's bad.
Where's your visa? You got to be very careful.
Right, right. So now let's just change gears for a second. So the person says, okay, I've got the visa. I did everything properly. I'm now in the United States. We're going to talk with Freddie in a minute about how do I buy my house and everything else. So I'm down there. I've got, as you said earlier, the spouse can go, the kids can go. Can the spouse work? Can the kids work? Or is everybody under that same visa, and they can all, the kids can work at Dairy Queen while they're in high school, and the spouse can get a job too? Like, is everybody covered, or are they not?
Well, the spouse is going to get, if you have a TN visa, again, there's other visas, there's the green card, etc. But case by case, if we look at, for example, a TN visa, and the spouse is going to have a TD visa as a dependent, typically they're not allowed to work on a TD visa. The children will have to go to school. So in order to go to school, you're talking about a college age child, or...
Well, that's an interesting wrinkle. So what if they're 16 or 17 years old, they want to pick up a part-time job at McDonald's?
Nope. No,
can't work.
No. If you're going to get a study permit or a study visa, they're not allowed to work. It's very clear on the permit and the work permit or the visa what they're allowed to do. And again, consultation is key.
Got it. Okay. So we're going to come back before we're done today about what happens when my child goes to school, like university in the United States while I'm there. Or if I'm in Canada, well, you go get a good job. Or you're in Canada and your kid's going to go to US school, which was my situation. So we'll come back to that in a second. So let's go to Freddie for a second. Now, so we've got the job offer in hand. I've met with Veronique or one of her colleagues. I've got all the right paperwork. I'm across the border. I'm starting work. I need a place to live. So how do I do that? Like, is it easy? Can they use my TD, my Royal Bank credit information, or not?
Right.
We talked about this in a previous chat, but I thought we should recapture some of that information today. How easy is it for me to just go get a mortgage at the local bank branch in Michigan or New Jersey or Texas?
Right, it's a great question. So we deal with this on a day-to-day basis. A recent case, a good friend of mine from Montreal transitioned over to Florida. And he works for a very large company, and the company sponsored him to come here to the United States. I don't know the specifics of the visa aspect of it, but that's how he was transitioning over. And some of the questions that he had prior to making that move, 6 months prior to making that move, is, okay, where am I going to send my kids to school? What area I'm going to live in? Can I buy a house? Can I leverage my credit in Canada to buy in the United States? Right? I don't have income that I'm filing in the United States. How are they going to underwrite my file? So those are all very important questions that he was going through, trying to understand that transitional period, how it was going to work, the timeline behind it. It was a big moving part, especially when you're moving your whole family. right? Your
Yeah.
wife, kids, the school. It's a big deal. I mean, I
Dog,
did it
cat.
myself. Right, dog,
Yeah.
cat, exactly. Right, vaccines. I got a whole bunch of vaccines before they go to school, so it's a lot.
Yeah.
But just to come back to your question specifically, it's not that complicated when you're working with the right people and have access to the right products.
Okay.
So just to kind of set the table here for you to understand, when you're working with like the big banks like Bank of America, Wells Fargo, they won't even look at that file. They won't lend on that. So it's a very unique and specialized foreign national, what we call foreign national mortgage product that allows them to go ahead and leverage whatever credit they have in Canada, whatever income they have in Canada, and be able to underwrite based on that and those specific details to be able to make their purchase over here.
Which is
Now,
important,
above
right?
and
Because
be
if you have someone who's had a successful career in Canada, they built a credit history here, they paid their credit cards, paid their mortgage, but as soon as they walk into that bank in the United States, they just don't exist
right,
from the bank's perspective. It's like you've been newly formed on the planet and you have no history of any kind, right?
correct. They can't borrow. They cannot borrow. Period. Right. That's why these specialized products are in place. And even above and beyond that, so when I'm talking about using, let's say, their income, so you have, let's say, a T4 individual, right?
Right.
Salary T4 individual, we qualify him a specific way. But sometimes you have a self-employed individual. He's got business in Canada, and that file is structured a little bit differently, but is very light in terms of documentation, allows them to transition very easily to make that purchase. Again, with the right structure and the right product.
Got it. Okay. So the person goes down there, they meet with you. You can then take them through how to use their credit bureau. Now, the mortgage is one issue, but we've had instances of, an executive who makes, 6 or 7 figures in Canada, relocates to the United States. They're shocked that they can't even get a credit card with a $500 limit. So it's not just the mortgage. Can you also help them navigate or show them how maybe to accelerate the credit bureau process so they can start getting car loans, credit cards, lines of credit, and alongside or in conjunction with a mortgage? The mortgage is the big one we think about, but there's all these other, other uses of credit that we have to be mindful of.
Yeah. So coming to the United States, if you have no credit, you are nothing, right? Unless you're buying everything in cash, right? If you're buying your home in cash, your car in cash, everything in cash, wonderful, good for you, great. You don't need credit. But eventually, credit will show up somehow, some way, and you're going to need it. I mean, you go to T-Mobile, they're going to run your credit before they give you an actual telephone line, right? Think about that. If you have nothing, so, or you have to put a big cash down payment again, right? Cash. But the idea is that being Canadian myself and having gone through that transition at the time with 4 kids, it was not so simple, right? We didn't really know, okay, well, what should we do and what steps should we do it? So there really is a 2-step process to this whole thing. Not to get into all the details right this moment, but the idea is that, okay, step 1, I want to relocate. I understand where I want to be. I understand what the process to get my mortgage. Now I am able to make my acquisition. I bought my property. I have my U.S. foreign national mortgage, let's call it.
Right.
Okay. When you're established over here, let's say as of day 1, we have designed an actual, what we call credit boost plan, where you can actually go ahead and accelerate the process to get a U.S. credit score. And there's very specific steps to go ahead and accomplish that, and very specific strategies to accomplish that, which then makes it so in a matter of as short as 90 days, we've seen it some cases as short as 60 days, literally having a credit score reporting on the U.S. Credit Bureau on their U.S. Social Security number.
Right. So they've got a FICO score that they now can utilize to get that T-Mobile and everything else. That's really critical. And does that process get accelerated or benefited when they've now got, employment income from a U.S. employer? Is that sounds like that might be something really helpful to accelerate that process, right?
It's a good question. It actually, one is not tied to the other. If they just follow the steps that we give them, especially if they're purchasing a property and they get a mortgage, once they actually get their U.S. mortgage and they get their U.S. Social Security number, we can tie, even though they purchase with their Canadian social, we can tie their U.S. social to their U.S. mortgage and have it report on their U.S. credit.
Aha. So they don't have to be busy going to work and getting, a semi-monthly or bi-weekly paycheck for 2 years before they finally blip the computer.
Right. Right. So it's about understanding the system and how you can navigate through it, and the little technicalities, which will allow them. And this is what we put part of the plan and how we help them structure themselves and give them the the way that they need to go. Because a lot of them, they also come here and there's public transportation, but you need a car. Bottom line is, you have children, you need a car. You're not taking them to school. You're not taking your three kids to school on the bus, right? It's going to be it's challenging. Then if you don't have the cash to buy a car, you need to finance, you need to lease it. How are you going to do that? You need credit.
Right.
So we explain to them how to go through that process and be able to get their credit to be able to accomplish all those things.
So so it sounds like if they're going to go down, a conversation with you before they begin even shopping for a home is really, really critical, because you're going to help also guide them not just on how to get the process, but how much can you qualify for? How much can you spend? How much can you purchase? That's also part of the advice you would give, right?
Yeah. Like Veronique said, a lot of the clients that we deal with are typically sophisticated enough and responsible enough to understand, hey, I need to go ahead and speak to this guy, that guy, and this guy to really figure out where I'm sitting. Now, sometimes they don't know who to speak to because they just don't know. They don't know how to ask the right questions. Where should I go? But by having that preliminary conversation, let's say with me, hey, Freddie, you live in the U.S. I know you transitioned over here. How's it going to work for me? What should I be looking out for? And then all of that unravels a whole bunch of stuff. And that's where the experts like you, Darren, will come in and speak with them about those specific pieces they need to talk about, or Veronique on the. So yeah, it happens, because the first thing they think about is, oh, I want to move. I want to get a house. They don't think about necessarily always immigration or, hey, I've got my assets in Canada. How am I going to transfer? What's going to happen? So yeah, it's critical.
Well, it's interesting because we often get pulled in when the person forgot about their assets in Canada. You know, they're usually so focused on the new job, the new career, moving the family, buying the home, getting the T-Mobile, North American plan and everything else. They kind of forget that their Canadian assets also become problematic. And so one of the things that we often encounter is someone who has their Canadian RSPs that they've built up, and they're like, well, those are fine. I'm going to go to the US. I'm going to leave them here. And unfortunately, what's starting to happen, and even though there's some regulatory exceptions and things that would allow the Canadian financial institution to keep dealing with the person in the US, a lot of the financial institutions in Canada, as soon as you change your address to the United States, or whenever the computer figures out that you've changed it, they're starting to be told, we don't want to talk to you. We're going to freeze your account. Because some of the... Did it happen to you?
Happened to my daughter. I had our ESP, I think.
Yeah, that's another one. Yeah.
With a trust plan, and we'd moved here. I mean, we're still Canadians. It doesn't make any sense. We have a residence in both. That exactly what you said. They said, we can't talk to you. Freeze.
Yeah.
That's my money.
Yeah. And it's very confusing because in some cases it isn't a rule. Like I've had people say, I can't find a tax rule. And I'm like, actually, it's not. It's the policy of the financial institution. And a big part of that, I'll start with RSPs for a minute, is because the SEC has granted what's called exemptive relief to Canadian financial institutions to deal with somebody, but really only as a snowbird. So as soon as somebody's an employee, well, you're moving. Are you still a snowbird? Or because are you just in Florida for a month and a half, or are you coming? Like, are you there permanently? What is the exemption actually? And also, the exemptions are state specific. And so what we're finding is the financial institutions in Canada generally do not want to be getting burdened with, well, what's the rule for New Jersey, and is it different than Nebraska? Or is it also different in California? They don't want to deal with that. So we're increasingly finding people saying, my bank or my financial institution is frozen me, and I didn't think that was going to happen. And I can't figure out why. I'm Googling like crazy. What do I do? So that's also a consideration when people are moving, is to make sure that the stuff you're leaving behind, you can still attend to while you're gone. And that is one of those things that people don't usually think about because they didn't anticipate an issue, right? And the good news is when they're going to the States, that happened to you too. Holy cow. I didn't plan. We did not rehearse this. We didn't know this is what you guys were doing.
Yeah. Listen, it's you learn, you live and you learn, right? I wish I had the opportunity to listen to a podcast like this or experts like you guys before I made my transition. But listen, it's a common mistake. You're so overwhelmed with the move and the children and the school. There's so many moving parts.
Right.
You don't. Sometimes you don't even think about it. It's just It's an honest mistake, but it's just about taking the time and really being able to get in front of the right people.
Well, and having people who have experience with the problems, because
Right.
that's one issue we encounter. People move and they didn't know this was a problem until suddenly it was a really important problem. We also experience the other thing when people are down working in the U.S. for not their whole career, and they're going to come back to Canada. We've seen them set up retirement plans and other investment protocols that they're not really portable back to Canada when they return home to retire, or whenever their period of time working in the U.S. is done. So, and they're going, wait a minute, I just built this little financial empire here. Why can't I bring it home with me? Or I can, but how much tax am I going to pay? So this is something we also help people with is understanding kind of the full cycle of work, employment, savings, retirement, and saying, like, how do we make sure that whatever you've built in either country, you can manage it or bring it with you or manage it from wherever you are so that it works both while you're gone and when you come back. And we just want to avoid those negative and nasty surprises because moving is hard enough, right? To say, oh, I didn't know that, no one told me that. And again, we also make the assumption that, hey, because we look kind of the same and we have the same cultural things, it should be the same, right? It's almost like we're two separate countries or something. It's so weird.
We are.
It's so weird. Okay, so let's change gears. Now, this one kind of hits me close to home. My son was a very good baseball player. I would joke with him that if he was a little bit worse, we would have had better family vacations because we spent a lot of time on baseball diamonds. So he was one of the very few Canadian young men that gets the chance to play Division I baseball in the U.S. So he was able to play baseball in the U.S. for a couple of years. I'm glad he's home because I don't have to pay for that anymore because, wow, is it expensive? But let's talk about that. So let's go back for me in time, but for someone else that either they're one of two scenarios. So either like us, we're in Canada, the kid goes to the US. What do we need to be thinking about for there? Or the situation of someone's moved to the US, they're working, they moved when their kids were teenagers. Now they're going to university and they're going to go to the school nearby. Can they just go? Or is there a little more to it than that? I'm going to guess there's more to it than that. This is always, we should actually rename this podcast to There's More to It Than That.
Is there more to it than that? There's always more to it than that. So, again, so depending on the age of the child, always different facts, different advice. But if you have a child under the age of 21 and the parent is qualified for a visa under what is now called something different, but we'll still call it NAFTA because everyone knows NAFTA.
Right. Not the Schmernowitz, whatever the word you used before, the umlaut or whatever it was.
UMZA.
And then, of course, it's different in Mexico. It's different in Canada. It was fine before. NAFTA was fine. Okay. But anyway, so here we have it. The child is now under TD visa. That child and the spouse, if the child is under 21, they can go to school with a TD visa. If the child is over 21, that is a different story. They cannot work on a TD visa. Canadian typically, again, like I said in the beginning, is a foreign national to the United States. A child over 21 is like your child, for example, mine is a dual citizen. So mine also cost me a fortune going to school here instead of going back to Canada. That was really frustrating. But a child like yours, Darren, who would come to the US would need what's called an I-20 from the school. An I-20 is a document the school issues, international student officers issue. There are special officers in schools who know how to do this. It takes a week or two.
I was just, sorry to interrupt. I was just going to mention for any parent that's kid's doing this, find that department and become friends with them because you will need them for copies of tax slips and all kinds of stuff. It's amazing how much you wind up interfacing with that particular. It's usually one person.
Great advice. Yes, absolutely. Those international student officers need to be your friend. They are responsive to emails. They are usually dealing with people from all over the world, not just Canada. So they might be multilingual as well. So the nice thing is with an I-20, that is already the first hurdle for for U.S. immigration, which is, does that child's study program qualify? And does the child financially qualify to be in the United States? And that's where the parents are in the background going, yes, he or she qualifies.
And on that front, by the way, so in most RESP plans, education savings plans in Canada, you can use the capital in them to fund university education in the United States. So that's good, but everybody should check their plan to make sure that that's possible, what that process is and what documentation you need back from that international department in the university. That's what we got to know them to make sure we got all the right tax slips and that kind of thing. So that's a really essential part of that. But the other reality is that as a Canadian, you generally have no ability to get any kind of aid that an American student might have access to. There's really no financial support for the Canadian family, unless perhaps they're working in the US, right? Or is that something that I'm incorrect on?
Well, that part I don't really get involved
Okay.
with. I just make sure that we make sure they have the proper documentation to be able to go to school in the US. I'll probably send them to you, Darren, or to Freddie to figure out the financial piece behind that. I
Yeah,
don't
we
know
weren't
what.
eligible for it based on anything. So I quit asking questions when they told me no.
Even though he was such a good baseball player, there was nothing
Right.
else
Well,
that
so
he.
yeah, there was a little bit of it. Listen, if he played football or if he was 7 feet tall and playing basketball, would have been better. But baseball doesn't quite pay that much. But in terms of the financial aid, as a Canadian in Canada, there was no eligibility for that. But I think if you're working in the US, that might be a consideration, is what are some of the supports. But a lot of them are very much income dependent. And also which school, like Ivy League schools, don't have any scholarships, for example. They don't have any athletic scholarships. So if you need financial aid, then it's a question, do you qualify? So it does. So that, and because of the cost of a US school compared to a Canadian school, these are really important things for people to plan ahead for, right?
Yeah,
You're
I
not,
mean,
unless you've got a lot of money, you can't really pay for Harvard on your credit card.
right.
Yeah.
So I've asked myself the question often as to why there is an attraction to coming to study in the United States. I can't answer it considering that I know the cost difference, and I think Canadian schools are excellent. However, things happen and people choose different things. So if they do, there's a process immigration wise. And that I-20 that we were discussing will lead to an F1 visa. The F1 visa is what will govern the student's ability to study in the US.
So while we're on this one, because a lot of one of the reasons I think a lot of the Canadian kids go to the U.S. and is kind of my son is athletics, right? As the athletic opportunity. So one of the things I'm going to ask you about, because this is a relatively new change, is that the NCAA now allows student athletes, if they're really awesome, to start receiving compensation through endorsements, which is something that never happened before. But you mentioned that the Canadian students cannot work while they're in the US. So forget getting the part-time job. There's no way to do that. Can they receive an endorsement contract potentially?
That's a great question. They might need to go through a few steps. An endorsement may qualify for an exemption. It's not a situation I've come across.
That's fair. It's also fairly new that this has even been possible. So
yeah, that's great. It would seem to me logically that an endorsement is not, that student is obviously qualifying because of a special ability. So whenever there's a special ability, there are other kinds of visas we can look at. It might be an O visa, a P visa, different alphabet soup. So I call it the alphabet soup of visas in the United States. So,
okay, but that's an interesting consideration for people to look at, because this is a relatively new opportunity for student athletes. So my son was good enough to cost me a lot of money to go play, but not good enough for someone to pay me to have him go there. So there was no endorsement. Nike did not call. There was no, there were no Air Colemans that were getting made, unfortunately. Although we are open to offers if anyone from Nike's listening. We are open, so we would be happy. Or Under Armour, I'm not. The brand does not matter. Just we'll take your check. We'll take your check.
Call.
So just call. So now, Freddie, question for you. So if the parent, the child's going to the United States, if they're not in residence, and I said, look, I would like to buy a property for him to live in, buy a house for him to live in, and because that's becoming a fairly common thing that we see people up here do, is they'll say, look, my kids are going to be in school. Why don't I buy a house they can live in and get some, 3 or 4 buddies and they can all share and that kind of thing and use it as a bit of an investment. So if I wanted to do that, for example, are I able to, I obviously I could use my Canadian line of credit, my resources, but could I buy a property and just get a mortgage on it? Or if I'm in Canada?
Yeah, so we come across that often. We come across it often, not just in this scenario, but people call us and say, "Hey, listen, I have my child that's going to be going to New York, and we're going to be going to school over there. And instead of spending $5 million a month on rent for a little box, I want to be able to make the investment and purchase something." Okay, great. So we have the ability it's structured slightly differently than the one who's actually moving here and will be using that
Right.
residence as a primary.
That's
This
what
will
I was curious
treat,
about, because it's
yeah,
not the same as somebody moving, as we talked about. This is like, I'm in Canada, but they're there, and I'm going to tangle this up a
right.
little bit more.
Right, which is really not a problem, and the structure is treated in such where it'll be or considered an investment property or a
Okay,
second home.
got it.
To be clear, not for the purpose of taxation, but for the purpose of mortgage.
Okay,
The way that that's treated on a taxation level is it could be treated
that's a whole
differently,
other
but
chat, right?
a whole other chat, correct. So second home or investment property, and the requirements are really nice because they fall into the same requirements that we have on our foreign national mortgage product that would actually be the person moving in their primary residence. So as easy to qualify, as simple to qualify, and it allows them to not only say, hey, you know what, I'm not going to be burning the money in rent. I'm going to have the ability to put it into a mortgage, build the equity of the property, and be able to have a piece of real estate that's there. And eventually, when they want to sell it, or, rent it out to other students that may be depending on the area that they're in.
Yep.
So we do come across that often, and it's fairly straightforward for us based on the product and the way that we have it structured for them to get into a property.
Well, that's interesting, because we've had people try to do that. Their kid goes to school in Massachusetts or Texas, and they would like to buy it,
Yep.
and they go to the local bank branch, and it's like, forget it, this isn't happening.
Yep.
Right? You're from Canada. Where's
Correct.
that? We don't know how to.
Exactly. Your money is colored. We don't take that. It's multicolor.
Well,
No,
then they
thank
say,
you.
"Oh, I'll give you a toonie." They're like, who? What? They don't get it at
A
all.
toonie.
A toonie. They don't understand. But here's another question in terms of while the child's away, or while they're there. How is it really important while people are working in the U.S. or as the kids to start getting them some kind of credit file, whether they're using credit? How would someone, or some tips to help people kind of accelerate that credit? I don't want to give you all the secrets, but have you got a couple little things that help people to just, is it like maybe you give your kid a cell phone in their name or something like that? What are things that can be done to boost their ranking?
Yeah, it's a great question. Actually, we came across that many times where what happened is we had the kid who was going to school graduate. And he's like, okay, I want to continue to live in the United States, right? How do I deal with that on a visa standpoint? I don't know, but they were asking about that transition. But they're like, okay, I got the visa figured out, but I want to be able to now go out and be able to rent a place, let's say.
Right.
Well,
Yeah,
to rent, for most places, when you want to rent, they check your credit.
that's right.
And they're here for 4 or 5 years, and they never did anything about actually trying to build their credit.
Right.
Right. So there are similar ways and strategies that we use for the people that are moving from Canada permanently to United States. For people that are moving here temporarily, the key though is they would have to have a U.S. Social Security number because that's what everything is built off of. So if they do have one, then there are certain plays and strategies we put into play for them to actually get their credit built out. Fairly quickly, so they have the ability to A, get a credit card, apply for a credit card, right, and help them build their credit. B, get a cell phone and other things that
Bank
may
account,
require
that kind of
credit,
thing,
a
right?
car, whatever the case. Yeah,
So this is really important, because when the parent moves down, they should be mindful of, how do I help my child build some kind of credit
yes,
exposure, or if they're a student, how do they do that?
yeah,
Now, you mentioned something interesting there that we should kind of zero in on. So Veronique, so the child's down there on a student visa, they graduate, or because they're graduating from a U.S. school, there might be U.S. company recruiters. Can they just, because they graduated from a U.S. school and they have a U.S. student visa, do they automatically have the right to work?
No, they have to change status. There's a concept called adjustment of status in the United States. And we have a similar concept in Canada. The idea is you came in on one status, now you're changing status. Changing status might even be changing to a visitor status. So they might want to adjust their status from an F1 to a B2, which is a visitor status for a little while. And then they get a sponsorship. Depending on the sponsorship, remember they're Canadian.
Right.
I might advise them, oh, this is great. You're on the list of professionals for NAFTA. We're going to flagpole you. That means I'm going to prepare your application. I'm going to send you back to Toronto or Montreal if it's closer. And I'm going to, wherever that is, it might be on the West Coast, but I'm going to make you go, turn around the flagpole, not literally, please, not literally, and come back in. And then at that point, the CBP officer would study the file and hopefully award the type of visa that you've applied for.
So I'm going to tee up our next conversation, which is connected. Like, what if they just decided to get a fiance and they decided to get a spouse? Does that not just shortcut the whole process?
So first,
coming up on our next conversation.
Prenup.
Yeah.
Can we talk about that? I actually had an immigration client come to me years ago, and he sat there and he told me, here's my new wife who didn't speak the same language, who he met in a tomato field somewhere. She was a legal immigrant, but I said, and you make how much money? Okay, I'll get you your visa if you get a prenup first. How about that?
Got it.
Yeah.
So because that's another reality, especially when you have, you're establishing your family, your kids are Canadian, but they may meet an American and fall in love. And then what happens next? Because as many people discover that when you marry an American, you also marry a tax regime. That's going to be the focus of our next conversation for everybody. So with that, I think we covered a lot of ground today. Did we miss anything? Anything else to add or final thoughts, Freddie, Veronique?
No, I think we covered a lot of ground and some great advice for everybody.
Okay, and Veronique, any other final parting comments for today?
Think about it before. Get your visa. Think about how to establish credit. Think about how to move your assets or remember your assets. I think those are really good fundamental things to think about. Like you said, Freddie, I like that expression. A lot of moving parts, but all those parts are important.
So you got to be like Scouts Canada. Be prepared. And remember you too. That's the other one. Okay. Well, with that, thanks very much, guys. I always appreciate our conversations. And for those of you that were joining us for this, thank you very much for watching. We'll see you on the next one.
Can we do our little...
You're going to do your thing now? There you got to do the thing. Gang signs. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Take care.
This has been Two-Way Traffic with Darren Coleman of Portage Cross-Border Wealth Management. Thanks for watching and listening. If you have any questions or comments or ideas for new episodes, send us an email at twowaypodcast@gmail.com. And you can find the Two-Way Traffic Podcast on Facebook and Twitter. This series is a production of the Acme Podcasting Company.
On behalf of the Two-Way Traffic Podcast and Portage Wealth of Raymond James, thank you for listening to this conversation. This podcast has been prepared by and expressed the opinions of Darren Coleman and his guests, and are not necessarily the opinions of Raymond James Ltd. Statistics, data, and other information presented are from sources Raymond James believes to be reliable, but their accuracy cannot be guaranteed. This podcast is for information purposes only and is not construed as an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of securities. Investors considering any investment should consult with their investment advisor to ensure that it is suitable for the investor's circumstances and risk tolerance before making any investment decision. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Information provided in this podcast is general in nature and should not be construed as providing legal, accounting, and/or tax advice. Should viewers have any specific questions or issues in these areas, please consult your legal, tax, and/or accounting advisor. Raymond James Ltd. is a member of the Canadian Investment Protection Fund. Raymond James USA Ltd. is a member of FINRA and SIPC. Raymond James Ltd. and Raymond James USA Ltd. financial advisors may only transact businesses in provinces and/or states where they're registered.